Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to our deep dive into the legacy of Cesar Chavez. You probably know him as a hero of the Mexican American civil rights movement, but there's more to his story than many people realize.
Yeah.
We've got articles, historical perspectives. We even have some quotes from Chavez himself. We're going to unpack all of it. Get ready, because you might just see him in a whole new light by the time we're done.
What's fascinating is that Chavez's life embodies the idea that history is rarely simple.
Yeah.
He was both a powerful symbol and a really complex person.
Right.
And it's that tension that makes this deep dive so interesting.
Okay. So let's start with the image most people have of Chavez. The champion of farm workers leading boycotts, fasting for justice. He became an icon of hope, often compared to Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr.
Right.
Did he live up to that image?
Well, there's no denying his accomplishments. You know, the Delano Grape Strike.
Right.
A years-long struggle that ended in a major victory in 1970. It forced growers to recognize the union and grant better working conditions. It's a testament to the power of organized labor,
Yeah.
especially for a group as marginalized as migrant farm workers.
That must have been a huge turning point. What kind of impact did that have?
So think about the impact of that victory. Just a few years later, in 1975, California passed the Agricultural Labor Relations Act. For the first time, farm workers in California had the legal right to collective bargaining.
Wow.
That meant they could finally negotiate for better wages, better working conditions. This was a huge win for Chavez and the movement.
So we have Chavez, this charismatic leader, achieving these incredible victories for farm workers. But you mentioned there's more to this story, right? It can't all be sunshine and roses.
Exactly. If we look closer, some cracks begin to appear in that iconic image. While Chavez was a powerful symbol, some historians point out that his leadership style wasn't without its problems.
That's surprising. It makes you wonder if there were other times when Chavez prioritized his image over practicality. Did the historians find any examples of that?
Well, think back to the Delano Grape Strike and the power of boycotts. Early on, Chavez actually resisted using boycotts as a tactic.
Really?
Historian Matt Garcia argues that Chavez saw boycotts as too radical.
Mm.
He eventually came around. But it highlights how his leadership wasn't always about pragmatism. It was sometimes about maintaining a certain image.
So he was hesitant to use a tactic that ultimately proved incredibly successful. Why would that be?
That's where the complexity of Chavez comes in. Some argue that he was concerned about maintaining control of the movement. As the United Farm Workers grew, his leadership style became increasingly concentrated. He consolidated power, sometimes even pushing out potential rivals within the movement.
What motivated Chavez to consolidate power like this? What were the potential benefits and drawbacks of that approach?
Miriam Paul, a historian who studied Chavez extensively, suggests that he became fixated on being seen as a spiritual leader, almost like a modern-day Gandhi. And that desire for spiritual authority might have overshadowed the practical needs of the movement.
So we're starting to see a different side of Chavez now, one that's a bit more complicated than the straightforward hero narrative. But how did this affect the farm workers movement in the long run? Did this desire for control help or hurt the movement?
By the late 1980s, the United Farm Workers' influence had waned considerably.
Oh.
Now, there were a lot of factors at play, economic shifts,
Yeah.
anti-union political forces gaining power. But some historians argue that Chavez's leadership style, combined with the union's failure to adapt to these changing conditions, also contributed to the decline.
So the movement that Chavez built, the one that achieved so much, couldn't quite maintain its momentum. Why do you think that was?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it gets to the heart of how we interpret Chavez's legacy. There are a few different schools of thought on this, each offering a unique perspective.
These different schools of thought highlight how complex Chavez's legacy really is. Tell me more about them.
Well, some historians, like Mario Garcia, belong to what we might call the progressive school. They emphasize Chavez's symbolic importance as a unifier for Mexican American and how he raised awareness of their struggles on a national stage. They see his focus on nonviolent resistance as a crucial element of his success, especially in garnering public support.
So for them, it's about the big picture impact, the inspiration he provided.
Exactly. Then you have historians like Randy Shaw and Vicky Ruiz who fall into what some call the social history school. They're less interested in Chavez as this singular figure and more focused on the grassroots power of the UFW, how it mobilized marginalized communities and inspired other social movements. They highlight the collective effort and community organizing that fueled the movement's victories.
So they're looking at the nuts and bolts of how the movement actually functioned, how people came together to create change. But what about the historians who take a more critical stance? How do they view Chavez and the UFW?
That's where the revisionist school comes in. Historians like Matt Garcia, who we mentioned earlier, acknowledge Chavez's flaws and the UFW's decline while still recognizing his achievements. They argue that we need to grapple with the complexities of his leadership and the movement's trajectory to fully understand its impact.
That seems like a balanced view, trying to move beyond simply praising or condemning him. What about the larger historical context? Did any historians place Chavez's work within the broader narrative of U.S. history?
Absolutely. You have the post-colonial school. Historians like Juan Gonzalez connect Chavez's work to the broader context of U.S. history and the exploitation of Mexican and Latino labor, going back centuries. They argue that understanding this larger system of oppression is crucial to understanding Chavez's fight and its limitations.
So we've got these different schools of thought, each focusing on a different facet of Chavez's legacy. But what did Chavez himself have to say about his work? Did his words match up with his actions?
That's a great question. And luckily, we have some powerful quotes from Chavez that give us a glimpse into his philosophy and motivations. Let's see how his words measure up against what we've learned about his actions. One of Chavez's most famous quotes is, "The fight is never about grapes or lettuce. It is always about people."
That's a powerful statement, really puts the focus on the human element at the heart of his activism. But how does that align with the more authoritarian aspects of his leadership that we discussed earlier?
That's where things get interesting. Chavez was deeply inspired by the principles of nonviolence, championed by figures like Gandhi and Dr. King. He believed in fighting for justice, while maintaining dignity and respect for everyone.
But some might say that consolidating power, pushing out rivals, goes against those very principles. How do those two sides of Chavez coexist?
Some historians, like Miriam Paul, argue there's definitely a tension there. They point to instances where Chavez may have prioritized his own authority over the voices of others within the movement.
So it's possible that the reality of leadership was a bit more complicated than the image Chavez projected. It makes you wonder how much of that was a conscious choice and how much was just the pressure of leading such a high-stakes movement.
It's a great question to consider. Others might argue that Chavez's emphasis on discipline, control, was necessary to maintain unity. In the face of such pressure from powerful agricultural interests, remember, they were up against a system designed to exploit and silence farm workers.
So maybe it wasn't as simple as Chavez being power-hungry. Perhaps he felt those tactics were essential for the movement's survival. It's fascinating how one historical figure can spark such a range of interpretations. What's important to me is getting a full picture, seeing all sides of the story.
Absolutely. Chavez's story reminds us that history is rarely about heroes and villains. He was a complex individual who inspired millions, achieved real change for farm workers, but also exhibited flaws, and made decisions that some saw as controversial.
It sounds like we're being challenged to hold two opposing ideas in our minds at the same time. Chavez, the champion of the people, and Chavez, the leader who sometimes made choices that seemed to contradict his own principles.
Exactly. It's in that tension that we find the most compelling questions and the most valuable insights. So as we explore Chavez's legacy, it's important to remember that complexity.
Okay, so we've gone from hero worship to a more nuanced understanding of Chavez's leadership. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the lasting impact of Chavez and the United Farm Workers. Even if the movement itself declined, surely his influence extended beyond just labor rights.
Absolutely. One of Chavez's most enduring legacies is how he galvanized the Mexican American community on a national scale. He helped pave the way for greater political engagement and representation for Latinos in the U.S.
That's huge. Can you give us some specific examples of that impact? How did Chavez's work translate into tangible changes for Mexican Americans, beyond the fields?
Think about the rise of organizations like the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, or MELDEF, formed during this era to fight for civil rights. Through the legal system, they saw a need for legal advocacy, representation within the Mexican American community, and they stepped up to fill that void.
So a direct response to the need for legal support that was brought to light by the activism of the time.
Precisely. And then you have groups like the National Council of La Raza, or NCLR, which focused on broader social and economic issues affecting Latinos. They were also energized by the activism of the 60s and 70s. and saw the need for a unified voice, advocating for the needs of the growing Latino community.
And what about political representation? Did Chavez's movement have an impact in that arena?
Definitely. The Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project, or SVREEP, was another key organization that emerged during this time. They focused on registering Latino voters and increasing their political participation, recognizing that political power was essential to achieving lasting change.
So we're seeing a pattern here. These organizations, MALDEF, NCLR, SVREP, all emerged during a time of heightened activism awareness, fueled in part by Chavez's movement. It seems like his legacy extends far beyond just labor rights.
It does, and it demonstrates how social movements often plant seeds that blossom in unexpected ways. Chavez helped spark a broader movement for Mexican American empowerment, and the fruits of that labor are still being harvested today.
It's almost as if his story asks us, what can we learn from both his triumphs and his shortcomings to build lasting change that truly outlives its leaders?
Now you're getting to the heart of it, and that question is what we'll explore as we wrap up this deep dive into the complex legacy of Cesar Chavez.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from Chavez the icon to the more complex reality of his leadership, the different ways historians interpret his legacy, and the ripple effects of his activism that we still see today. What stands out to you as the most significant aspect of his story?
You know, I think what's most striking is how Chavez's story challenges us to think about the nature of leadership itself. He was undeniably charismatic and effective at mobilizing people. But his story also raises these questions about the potential pitfalls of concentrating power. Even when you're pursuing a just cause, it makes you wonder, is there a tension inherent in movements built around a single, powerful leader?
Yeah. It's almost like he embodies the paradox of leadership, the need for a strong, unifying figure, and the potential for that same figure to become an obstacle to the movement's long-term growth.
Exactly. It makes you think about other social movements throughout history. How many have truly outlived their founders and continue to thrive? It seems like building something sustainable requires more than just a charismatic leader. It requires systems, structures, a shared vision that can adapt, evolve over time.
So what can we learn from Chavez's successes and his shortcomings to build more resilient movements for change?
That's the million-dollar question. Perhaps it's about empowering a broader base of leaders, fostering a culture of collaboration, shared decision-making, and being willing to adapt to changing circumstances. It's about recognizing that true, lasting change often requires a long-term vision that extends beyond the lifespan of any one person.
It's a humbling reminder that even the most iconic figures are human, with all the complexities and contradictions that come with being human.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to engage with history in a critical and nuanced way, not just to celebrate heroes or condemn villains, but to understand the forces at play that shape our world, the choices we face in our own lives as we work towards a more just and equitable future.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the legacy of Cesar Chavez, we're left with more than just facts and dates. We're left with questions, insights, a deeper understanding of the complexities of leadership, social movements, and lasting change.
And hopefully those are questions that will stay with you long after this deep dive is over.
Thanks for joining us on this exploration. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.